All right, part three, we're almost done. So part three, I like to end on a slightly hopeful note about what can be done. So we talked about what is conservation biology and then all the threats to biodiversity, and now we're going to talk about what can be done. So first of all, invasive species management. We as humans are really good at overexploitation. So in order to control invasive species, let's just do what we're really good at, overexploit them. And so this has been working out really well in areas of Florida and the Caribbean where this lionfish that I talked about has taken over, because basically there's been a push to make lionfish a delicacy where restaurants use it for some of their best cuisine. You can, people hunt for it, mostly using like spearfishing techniques, and then are able to sell it to restaurants. It apparently tastes pretty good. And so like, by now saying like, let's hunt this thing, that's able to control that population that has no natural predators besides us in the Caribbean. There's also a whole field of habitat restoration, which is taking areas that have gone through degradation or fragmentation or destruction and kind of putting it back to its original state. So this is basically people who go out and plant trees and try to put it back to what it should have been like if we weren't here. Here on campus, or well, not here on campus because no one's on campus, but on campus, you can go to the Purchase College Native Plant Garden, and this is what we're trying to do restoration on a fairly small scale. And so this was a group of students last year came to me and thought we should have this garden space kind of turned into an area where native plants can thrive. So last spring, we kind of built this whole area, and now I just checked on it last week, and it's growing, because the whole point of a native plant garden is that even with little human interaction, it should be able to maintain. So if you want to follow us, you can follow us on Instagram. I'll be posting pictures all summer of what's going on there. And hopefully when we're back on campus in the fall, there'll still be some beautiful flowers, and you can hang out there. It's behind the dance building on the way to the commons. And so it's a really nice little area with picnic tables and a kind of a place to hang out. And it's also providing this important ecosystem service. There's also a big push for captive breeding, which is that it's different than maybe just zoos. It's the idea of complete captivity versus eventual reintroduction. So some of these programs are just building genetic diversity by breeding in zoos, and some of them are hoping to eventually reintroduce them back into the wild. I cannot stop thinking about Tiger King and all of the horrible things that were happening to large cats in that documentary, which wasn't even the whole point of the documentary, I don't think, but that's what I took away from it. And the idea with some of that captive breeding isn't for eventual reintroduction, but a lot of breeding programs, the Bronx Zoo is really well known for some of these captive breeding programs. What does happen if we have too much captive breeding, you can create what we call a conservation reliant species, which is basically a species that cannot persist without human intervention. One of these examples right now is the giant panda, where we're doing a really good job of making them happy in captivity and getting them to breed and eventually reintroducing them to the wild. But in the end, they're probably going to need a heavy hand from us just because of the amount of habitat destruction that's gone on in their area, that there isn't really a place to return them to that they can survive. Another example is the California condor, which is this big, beautiful, I would say, some would say ugly vulture that lives out on the West Coast. This bird was driven way down to extinction. I think there was 20-something individuals left in the population, mostly because of ingesting lead. And so what they did is they brought all of them into captivity and started a captive breeding program, but then reintroduced them back into the wild. So there's actually breeding pairs in the wild now who are surviving and producing offspring, which is really great. But these are a fairly conservation reliant species because we haven't actually cleaned up the lead problem. And so these birds are still eating high amounts of lead and getting sick from it. Periodically, one will get sick and they'll have to go be caught, brought into captivity, and kind of treated for lead poisoning before it can get reintroduced back into the wild again. So this is an issue where we're not fixing the underlying issue, and so these guys are going to be conservation reliant for the foreseeable future. So those are all species that just have small populations or are kind of increasing. But now I want to talk about this movement that's called de-extinction. And this is just one of the more wild things that I've ever really considered. I was exposed to it a bunch of years ago because I thought it was kind of crazy that anybody was talking about reviving extinct species. But when I was doing my PhD, we actually were asked to talk about it in a couple meetings because the point is that this is happening. Like, scientists are out there working on this. And so now it's more of a reality than a possibility, I guess. It's just a matter of how long and what species comes out. And so they wanted some conservation biologists to kind of guide what type of species we think we could bring back. So if you're not familiar with this, I'm going to show you a video that kind of explains it. It should make you worry, especially if you've seen Jurassic Park, and kind of think of some issues with this as you're watching this video, and we could talk about them more on Tuesday.
The idea of de-extinction is that we can bring back species that are now completely gone. A major flashpoint of interest in what has now led to de-extinction technology happened about 10 years ago when Dolly the sheep was created. In many ways, Dolly was the harbinger of the kind of technology that will permit us to do even more sophisticated kinds of creation of species that used to exist, species that still exist, and perhaps even species that never existed. We can group relevant methods into three large categories. There's backbreeding, which humans have practiced literally for thousands and thousands of years. This is being done right now in Western Europe, trying to recreate what's known as the aurochs. The way cows look today is not the way the cattle family looked 10,000 years ago. So if your problem is to recreate one of those primitive cows, what do? Well, you reach back into the genetic code by selecting for animals that have slightly longer horns or a bigger bulk or the kind of hide coloration that you think is appropriate. It is a very viable and low-tech way of de-extinction. And the investigators trying to do this, backbreeding to aurochs, have had some success. The animals look quite a bit like old representations that go right back to cave paintings. But what is it really? What it is really is a constellation of traits that you selected for, and you know nothing really about how close it is physiologically to an aurochs because there's no way of examining a living aurochs at present. You also don't know about behavior. Behavior tends not to fossilize in any realistic manner, and the degree to which any modern cow resembles an aurochs in terms of behavior is a complete unknown. A second method for de-extinction that has improved greatly in the last 10 years is cloning, particularly the kind of cloning known as somatic cell nuclear transfer. You take the genetic material, the nucleus, of one cell, you put it into another, an egg, and that egg is then placed in an animal that will act as surrogate mother and produce an offspring. There's also been massive improvements in what we can call synthesis. Synthesis involves making up our own sequence, just like in a recipe. If you have two species, one extinct, one living, you can get the genetic material of the extinct one and compare that to the living one. The passenger pigeons died out finally almost exactly 100 years ago. Passenger pigeons have several very close relatives among pigeons, and one is the band-tailed pigeon, which is very close indeed. In recent years, scientists have been able to isolate the differences between the genomes of extinct passenger pigeons and living band-tailed pigeons. They have been able to inject these novel sequences into the germline of developing band-tailed pigeons, and using surrogates with the sex cells of passenger pigeons. If you crossbreed them one to another, you will, in the next generation, get something that should look exactly like a passenger pigeon. Now comes the basic question here, which is, what are you going to do with passenger pigeons, assuming that you go ahead and create a whole flock of them? It's been estimated that there were probably more passenger pigeons than any other kind of bird ever. I don't know what we would do with 1 billion passenger pigeons. We don't like pigeons to begin with in this place. A very important thing to consider about extinctions in general in the course of life on the planet is that the waters close very quickly when a species disappears. What tends to happen is that other species move in. This is how evolution, in fact, works. The mammoth behind me perfectly illustrates some of the issues that we're going to face with de-extinction. There is no place for several more very large herbivores in a place like the US, except under very controlled conditions. Who's going to take care of them? How are you going to provision them? Are we thinking that we're going to bring back the Pleistocene by virtue of having a few extinct species? What we're really talking about is undertaking a whole lot of unplanned experiments, the consequences of which are very hard to predict. We don't want a situation in which we drive out species that are perhaps already endangered thanks to us with something else that we drove to extinction thousands of years ago. De-extinction, to the degree it will take place, should be limited in its scope, limited in its ambition, limited in the kinds of species that we bring back. But if there was one animal I could vote for to bring back, it would be one of these giant ground sloths. If you want people to be interested not only in what the planet still has and how we might conserve it, but what the planet has recently lost, and perhaps most particularly what it's lost because of human activities, then to see these again, to see mammoths again in the flesh, would be an exciting prospect. It would raise rather than dampen interest in preserving what we have and what we used to have.
All right, I hope that rather blew your mind because it's a little nutty to me, and yet it's actually happening. So I would love to hear what you guys think about it at some point. So I'm going to be on Zoom on Tuesday, April 28th at 1 p.m. so I can answer questions, and I'd love to hear what you think about the extinction stuff. I'm real conflicted for all the reasons that the guy on the video said. I don't know if it's the smart thing to do, but yet it's still moving forward. If any of this has kind of interested you, there's some follow-up classes that you can take in environmental studies. So I teach this coming fall general ecology with a lab. And in future years, you might be able to take wildlife toxicology, conservation biology, or ornithology with me. This fall, Dr. Kramer is also offering urban ecology, and so that has a lab associated with it too. So both of those are really great kind of upper level lab-based classes to follow up on stuff. And if we're ever back on campus, this is my main dude, Ben the dog, who's often in the office with me. So my office is down in the basement of Nat's Eye. So feel free to stop by and say hi to us when we're all on campus together. So stay safe. I hope everyone's staying sane. Email me with questions or come to Zoom on Tuesday and I'll answer them there. Okay.